Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. What do you think about China? Mm? This is one of those days when we have to really give some thought to our position in the world. I'm here in Canada, and we have some issues with China. And Bill Fletcher is in California, and I believe the U.S. has a few issues with China too. But the main thing that we need to talk about is the relationship between China and all the rest of the world regarding global warming, because every country has to do its part. And I'm not sure what we're to make of what China is doing and how we should relate to it. Good morning, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
Good.
Good to
Bill
be on.
has Bill has been on this show before, so some of you may already be acquainted with his work. He is a retired engineer and corporate executive, and one of the few corporate executives I know. So we have totally different social circles, Bill. And I'm glad to now be acquainted with what do I want to call the business elite of the world. And you're it. Okie doke. Let's go. How's China, and what do you think we ought to do about it?
Well, Metta, let me give you just a minute on my background.
All right.
I'm retired now, but I worked for a major international corporation, Rockwell International, and um, in, and spent a lot of time in Asia and specifically in China. For a while, my wife and I lived in Hong Kong, and I ran the Asia Pacific region that included China, and we had a joint venture there, and we had a number of major international customers doing where we had to support their business in China. In addition, my wife and I really, we love traveling, but we were fascinated with China and took a number of extensive trips as tourists. We crossed China from Xi'an to Pakistan on the Karakoram Highway and the Silk Road and things like that. So
Hmm.
we spent a lot of time.
Could you do that on your own? I once, I think it was 1980, I took a 2 week tour of China, but it was a package deal with about 20 other Westerners. And I'm not sure, I wouldn't have wanted to even think of trying on my own without knowing Chinese. But do people now run around freely on their own, or how did you do it?
Well, we did. We went on a couple of tours, like we took a tour to Tibet. But for the, we would typically take 4 to 5 weeks on some of our trips, just because if you go to the trouble of going there, we wanted to go to remote parts of China. So we had a company, I think the name of it was Wild China, and this was a Chinese company that would arrange, a guide and driver and all your arrangements. So we had an English-speaking guide, and we, on several trips, traveled just the two of us to some fairly what would be remote parts of China, and we were always perfectly safe, very welcomed, and had some fascinating trips.
So what years would that have been?
Well, my first trip to China was in about 1980s, and probably the last time we were there was probably 3 or 4 years ago as a tourist. And we had business we had a joint venture in southern China on Xi'an, on the island of Xi'an. That's where we were assigned. It was not a good location for our business. And so we eventually were able to get relocated to Beijing and Shanghai. And my part of the business was factory automation. So we were mainly interested with large manufacturing companies in China. And we had a joint venture with a large machine tool company in China. And then Rockwell, the parent company I worked for, they had some business with Xi'an Aircraft Factory.
You make me. I don't know. I don't even want to go into this conversation, but let me mention it anyway. That word Rockwell has connotations, unless I'm mistaken. Aren't they in the nuclear weapons business?
No, they were. It was a conglomerate, and about 40% of its business was in aerospace and defense. They built the space shuttle. They Rocketdyne Division did all of the rocket engines that we used to send U.S. astronauts to space.
Okay.
They built the B-1 bomber, and they did do other defense contracts too. So they
Yeah.
were into that, but I was mainly in the non-defense side of the business.
Okay. All right. I'll let you be an okay guy.
But I just want to make sure that people understood I have some business experience in China, but also I am fascinated with China and thoroughly enjoyed my travels there.
That's terrific. Okay. Well, you're just exactly the right person to talk to, because I suppose we really want to talk about, it looks like China, I don't know why things get this way, but it looks like there's international tension building up, that China is becoming the enemy big time. And well, they always were, ideologically opposed to capitalist societies, but somehow we managed to get along during Deng's period and some while afterwards. But it looks like things are going from bad to worse now. I mean, Canada is feeling very stressed about it because, we have been holding this woman Meng on, I don't know how legitimate the charges are, but that she is somehow, as an executive for Huawei, is part of the I guess the Chinese government's effort to install surveillance equipment in the Huawei 5G system. That's the theory. And the US is worried about that and asked Canada to hold her and extradite her to the US, I believe. It was a couple of years ago or more. And she's free to run around Vancouver. I noticed today's paper, she wants to a little bit more freedom, but at any rate, in retaliation, China seized 2 Canadians who apparently have done nothing of any significance or anything wrong at all. I don't know, but they're holding them kind of as hostage for Meng. I don't know. Anyway, all of this has created a lot of bad feelings in Canada toward China, and a lot of apprehension about how much technological cooperation there can be. It looks like it might result in a division of the internet into 2 or 3 different realms, that are autonomous and maybe not cooperating too much. So that would be a really bad thing, I think, if the worldwide, internet system didn't hold together. There are a lot of bad consequences of this tension. And from my point of view, economic competition is just dandy. I don't have any problem with countries being up and coming and challenging capitalist countries. The only thing I have a problem with is human rights violations. So it does look like we're in good shape. Can give me your take on what our international situation is, the rest of the world vis-a-vis China. And then let's talk specifically about, if you will, the climate change issue.
Yeah. Well, let me give you sort of a little bit of my geopolitical attitude. I mean, first of all, I've never been mistreated in China, and I'm very impressed with what China has been able to accomplish over the last 40 years. And they have done a marvelous job in many ways of taking hundreds of millions of people out of poverty under Mao's communism and bringing them into a more modern economy and raising their living standards dramatically. And I think China is definitely a rival in the sense that they are a poor country that's now trying to become a rich country, and they are succeeding to some degree, not without problems. And but they don't have to be an adversary. That's the thing that I feel. I feel that we can and we and they can make the wrong moves and make it an adversarial relationship. But I think we are in competition with China, but it could be a healthy competition. The other thing is, I don't think of China as I thought of the Soviet Union. I was in the nuclear navy in the 60s at the height of the Cold War, when Russia and the United States had hundreds of nuclear missiles pointed at each other. And Russia was definitely a promoter of world communist domination. They had a political philosophy that they were spreading around the world, communism. China's not doing that. I mean, China is not trying to export their political philosophy or anything
Well,
like
frankly,
that.
I don't think they have a political philosophy. It looks to me like it's absurd to call them a communist society anymore. They're doing better as a capitalist society than we are.
Well, I mean, I would describe them as an authoritarian society. They definitely have a single party, the Communist Party, and they want to retain power. And they have a deal with the Chinese people. I mean, if they can provide stability and prosperity, the population will be relatively happy. And I think the average Chinese is coming out of poverty and coming out of chaos under like the Red Guards and that sort of thing. And so I think that if China is stable and growing and becoming more prosperous, the people are happy. I think I'm a little surprised that they are so hard on Hong Kong right now, because I would have thought they would have been treating Hong Kong much more benignly, let's say, as an example to Taiwan, to hopefully get Taiwan to peacefully become part of China. But those are issues that I think are local and we probably can't do anything about. But China definitely is. The other thing, China definitely has a plan. They are an authoritarian form of government. They have a long-range vision. They want to dominate certain industries. They want to be successful. And I think the average Chinese, when they wake up in the morning, they're not saying, how do they do something bad for the US and China? The US and Canada, excuse me. But their main concern is, how do we grow faster? How do we have more prosperity? How do we and how do we deal with pollution and some of these other problems that they have that are incredibly severe? I mean, the pollution problem in China is very bad. So I think, and the other thing is, we had some. China has been. Let's say stealing our technology. We gave it to them in many ways. They did require joint ventures. If you want to do business in China, you have to have a Chinese partner. And these are things that are not not consistent with the World Trade Organization, which China was allowed to join under the Clinton administration. And so there are some abuses that we have to stand up to. So I don't disagree with that. But I also think we may be a little naive, thinking if we allowed them into the WTO and be part of the world economy, they would be like us. Well, China's not going to be like us. They're going to be unique and not necessarily become an open democratic regime. And we just need to accept that. But I don't feel that they're as aggressive as Russia was. They don't have a desire to dominate the world. They do have a desire to become the biggest economic power in the world. And
well, I wonder if you'd feel the same way if you were a Uyghur.
Well, no, but I think that's true. I mean, I've been to the Uyghur areas of China and Tibet. I mean, yes, they are oppressing minorities. But the question then becomes, can we do anything about it? And we have interests with China, mainly, I think, in the environment and global warming. In spite of our differences, we have to cooperate with them. And I think it's very easy for us to be self-righteous about, and and I'm not minimizing the oppression of Uyghurs and Tibetans and others, but the question is, can we do anything about it? I think the U.S., like in Afghanistan and Iraq, we've been there 17 years and haven't done any good. So I think we need to not minimize those problems, but if we are going to let them become the single issue that dominates our thinking about China, we're going to make a mistake. We need to recognize our limitations to be able to make those changes.
Okay,
yeah.
I think substantively, I don't disagree with any of your points, but my heart really is with people who are oppressed. And I can't just say, well, can't do anything about it. Therefore, okay, go ahead and do what you're going to do to them. I won't say anything.
No, I wouldn't say that either. I wouldn't say that either. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, we have to be realistic about what we can accomplish and what are our priorities with China. I think our priority with China is we need to compete with them economically. And I think we need to work with them to deal with global warming. I mean, that's a huge common issue, and we can't let other issues prevent us from working together, in my mind.
Okay. I think I started off by saying, if it worked for human rights, I wouldn't have any problem, because I agree with you that economic competition is just part of life, and that's probably healthy and good. And what's wrong with that? No problem. But I do believe in human rights. And,
I do too.
And seriously, I think you've got to take a position on this every time it comes up, every time it's relevant, every time. You can't just say, well, too bad, I just can't do that. I guess it comes out of my own history of dealing with people in Russia, because during the Cold War, I was going there, and I found that, yes, officially everything looked right. I was invited to meetings by very high level people, very, very high cabinet level people, in meetings and my way was paid by the Soviet Peace Committee. I was a guest. They wanted to talk to people like me. I have no idea why they thought I had anything to say, but they would invite peace people as if we had some voice that could make a difference here. Well, we had more voice with them than we did with our own governments. But nevertheless, I would go and we'd sit at the table around, and talk, and with our little translation earphones on and so on. And I would say things like, well, we're trying to negotiate a new arms control treaty for nuclear weapons and stop the rivalry of having Euro missiles in Europe and so on. That was in the early 80s. And, it'd be a lot easier if there were not concerns about human rights violations in Russia. And people then on the other side would give their canned responses, which I knew I could predict exactly what they're going to say, and they would say it. And it would be an official statement and respectful, but nevertheless, it was a confrontation. And then we would get up and go have our coffee, and the guy would come over to me and say, good. That's just the way we want you to do it. Keep it up. That's what we need. And what I found, and people would give me thumbs up or wink at me in the hallway, these same people that were officially taking the position of the government, as soon as they were in any way in a private relationship with me, they would say, we exactly want you to state what you're saying and take a strong position on human rights and democratization. They wanted change like nothing. So I call these people termites. because they were boring within the party, like, subversives within communism.
Yeah.
And they really respected the fact that I wasn't hostile, I wasn't aggressive, I wasn't nasty, I was respectful, but nevertheless, every time I had a chance. And if I forgot, if at one time there would be a meeting and I didn't say it, they'd come to me and they'd say, "You forgot to talk about it. Please bring it up again, because this is what we need." So all I know is my experience was I could see that within what looked like a monolithic system, there was trouble growing. And this came out when Gorbachev came to power. He was the termite par excellence. He became the leader of this movement that actually made the changes that really were wonderful. So I feel people should take that kind of position, a principled position, every time you have a contact with somebody who's officially doing things that you cannot stomach. You have to say it, and then they may not like it, and in fact there's sometimes a lot of consequences, but nevertheless that's what we have to do. Now I don't claim that I changed the Soviet Union, or that, yes, you're right, I think we can't do much about China, but we can do that much, and I think we need to do that much.
Well, Metta, I mean, we need to talk about global warming, but I'd make one point. I mean, living in Hong Kong, that is a very free, dynamic economy. And in my wife's and my travels in China, I mean, in China too, we've met a lot of tour guides and others who were very unhappy with a number of things going on in China, and whether it's corruption or bad politics, and so I don't doubt that there's a lot of dissatisfaction in China with some of the things that are going on there, and I certainly would agree with you on human rights abuses in China and anywhere in the world. I just think that my concern is that if we are going to deal with a specific issue like climate change, we need to deal with that, and that doesn't prevent us from having a completely aggressive program in another area dealing with human rights. But I think if we say we're not going to deal with you on climate change until you make certain human rights changes, that probably won't work.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And it'd be a terrible decision. Yeah.
So we don't have to give up on human rights to deal with the other issues.
Okay. Yeah. So we don't substantively disagree on anything. I think maybe we put the accent in different places.
Yeah.
That's all. Okay. You're right. We're really here to talk about global warming, and that's where we should talk next. What do we have to say about what they're doing? I hear on the one hand, they've got all these coal mines and stuff, but I hear that they're also the leading force in building turbines and I don't know about solar, but yeah, how are they doing, and how can we cooperate better?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that would strike us, having been traveling in China for over 40 years, is they have a huge energy problem. As they modernize, they need a lot more energy, and they were coming out of a very, what I would say, primitive economy. And under communism, they did not have a lot of international trade. They weren't very rich, so they had to depend on local resources, which was largely coal. That's the only major domestic energy source that China had. Mm-hmm. And so I think their electricity system, you can also see plants that produce coal gas, where they take coal and make natural gas for home heating and things like that. Very messy, and parts of China are terribly, terribly polluted because of that. So that is a history that they're working rapidly to get out from under. And I think that there's really 4 reasons for China to really deal with minimizing their use of coal and getting on with renewable energy. And first of all, I think there's a genuine concern about global warming and things like that. But I think the biggest single thing is probably air pollution. I mean, the air pollution is terrible. And
That's
it
because of
also,
the coal, isn't it? Or
yeah, I mean, it's mainly coal and other, but they have been emphasizing economic growth over environmental protection for a long time, and now they have to get a better balance. And so I think dealing with air pollution, and as some of the Chinese people I've talked to, if you have a lot of air pollution, that also pollutes the water supply and the farmland and everything else. And so they have to deal not only with global warming, but I think with a huge pollution problem, starting with air pollution. And then I think the other thing is that China doesn't have, unlike the United States and Canada, a lot of oil and natural gas. So they have to import their oil. And that's a huge drain on the economy to have to pay for imports of large quantities of energy in the form of oil and coal from Australia. They can't even produce all the coal they need. And so I think there's an economic reason to want to go to renewable energy to reduce imports. And then I think the other thing that I think would be of concern to me, certainly, is China sees the renewable energy issue, the trend toward renewables as a huge business opportunity, which it is. And so they're looking at solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, batteries, all of that economic as major economic opportunities and as major businesses that they want to become the world leader on in. And they are actually being quite successful. So in my mind, when we in the US, where we want to create a lot of green jobs and things like that, most of those jobs are going to wind up in China if we aren't competitive. So China is, in my mind, has targeted many industries, but all of the industries related to dealing with global warming, wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles as major opportunities. And they're doing a good job.
How quickly can that transformation be made from a coal-based industry to largely or predominantly sustainable energy?
Well, in China now, they are the largest. They have the largest installed base of solar and wind, and I think they produce something like 60% of the world's solar panels. And so China does have huge land areas that deserts and things like that. So that would be good for solar development and for wind development, and they are making tremendous progress now. It's a huge economy, and the economy is growing every year. So, but now what I read is that solar and wind are very competitive and are more competitive than coal in most parts of China. But it takes a long time to develop enough wind and solar to not only deal with the growing need for energy, but also to displace coal-fired power plants. It takes time to retire them, and they can't do that overnight. So that has to be accomplished, let's say, over a 20-year period, where the percentage of renewables goes way up, and then the dependence on coal and imported oil and natural gas goes down. It can't happen overnight.
My
It is happening.
imagination of, I think, I call it imagination because I'm not sure I trust my memory enough to call it memory. Yeah. But I think during the Paris, the negotiations for the Paris Treaty, there were a lot of opponents or demands from used to be called underdeveloped countries, or then called developing countries, and now I don't know what you call China and India, but that China and India, for example, were not in the lead, and were wanting the already developed countries to take on more of the burden of cutbacks and accept more of the costs of transitioning to sustainable energy. I don't know how that went, but I think India was more resistant maybe than China was. But do you remember? I think there was one event when Barack Obama had to go find. I don't know whether she was there. I don't think it was she in those days. It would have been, I guess so, right? At any rate, the Chinese delegation was holding meetings privately, and he sort of burst in on them to try to have a real conversation about what deals they were trying to make. Is there? I guess what my question is leading to is there a continuing resistance or organized opposition on the part of any of the what used to be called third world countries against the demands for even stronger measures than the Paris Agreement adopted?
Well, let me mention one other thing with China. I mean, they announced in September of last year, 2020, that in front of the United Nations, that China is going to have a peak in their greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and that they'll reach net zero by 2060. And so that is a very bold initiative for the world's largest source of greenhouse gases. So in my mind, China has done more than the United States, certainly. And you can be skeptical about how serious they are, but I don't doubt that they are.
Okay, all right.
And so I think China's not asking for any help. They don't need it. Frankly, they're ahead. India, I think, is a different case. That's a much, has about the same population as China, but maybe 1/10 the standard of living. But even in India, coal is being displaced by renewables, and solar panels. Solar is getting to be the cheapest form of energy around the world. And I think just talking about the third world, let's say the developing countries like Brazil, cutting down the rainforest. I mean, there they may need help from the Western economies to, they just don't have the economic incentive to stop that on their own.
Yeah, that's a whole different conversation, and one that I think we really should be having.
That's a different conversation, but
it's a different conversation. It's also, in a way, more urgent, I think, because I would agree with you that, as far as I can tell, China is on the right track, right? The U.S. has not been, but now with Biden, they're turning around. I'm not sure that how much of a right track they're going to be on, but there's certainly a reversal from the Trump period coming, I think.
Well, I think, we can talk a little bit about that, but one thing I also want to mention about China is over the last 40 years, they have been developing their manufacturing economy. And frankly, I think the US has been neglecting manufacturing. And so China also has the world's most sophisticated manufacturing base today. And if you have a good idea in China, you have the resources to implement it very quickly on a big scale. So I think that China has developed certainly a world-class manufacturing capability in most areas, and is probably the leading manufacturer by many, many measures.
Mhm.
And I think in the U.S. we've allowed parts of our industrial base to atrophy, and we're now starting to see that, gee, we really have let some things deteriorate that we shouldn't have. And whether we can rebuild that soon enough or fast enough, I don't know. But we are in competition with China um, as a rival, not necessarily an adversary.
Right. I think that's a very fair statement, and I think one we ought to bear in mind.
Yeah.
I wonder now, what do you know about the consumption patterns in China? I mean, we rich folks are always being accused of consuming wastefully and unnecessarily and unsustainably. And there's never enough to satisfy us. If we have two houses, we want to have another cottage someplace else, etc. Or if we have two cars, we want a third one. Um, is that equally true in China, or are the consumers more the aspiration levels more sustainable, do you think?
I don't, and these are just my personal observations.
Yeah.
I mean, people in China and India and Africa around the world, they want what you and I have. We have a clean environment. We have a nice place to live. We have nice clothes. We have cars. And I think that they don't want anything different than we do. In China, it's hard to imagine, if you live in the U.S. or Canada with a lot of open space and so forth, how crowded China is. I mean, it's a very dense, urbanized area, and most people are living in small, high-rise apartments. And they don't have space. They don't have garages to park a car, even if they had one. And so I think that, they want air conditioning, they want reliable electric power, they want healthcare, they'd like to have a car. And China now is the world's largest automobile market based on units sold. I mean, a lot of their cars are much smaller than what you find in Canada, the United States. So I think that they are not that different as far as what they want than we are. And I don't think that the average Chinese is any more environmentally aware than you and I. They live with terrible air pollution, so they're much more sensitive to that than we are, because we don't have that problem to the extent.
Where does any of their air pollution come from? Transportation. I remember being in Europe at a time when it seemed to me, for example, in Hungary, the air was awful, and same in India. It was because of things like diesel. The cars and things use this. They would emit this awful black smoke. Do they still have vehicles that pollute the air that way, or is it just ordinary gasoline of the type that our cars are?
Well, I would, I don't have the specifics, but I could tell you in the urban areas of China, let's say if you're in Beijing or Shanghai, let's say, or even, the pollution from automobiles or vehicles, let's say, would be severe. But the general air pollution that's across the country is largely due to power generation using coal. That would be my view.
That's what I've heard. Mm-hmm.
And China is putting a huge push on the development of electric vehicles, and it's not just automobiles. They're producing buses, vans, and they are very heavily oriented toward electrifying their transportation system, and probably a good part of that is to eliminate urban pollution.
Yeah. Well, where are they going to get the electricity?
Well, ideally from renewables. I mean, obviously, if you want to have an electric vehicle, you have to produce the electricity, and I'd say that China is making good progress in renewable energy. Perhaps not fast enough for them or for us to displace coal, because the use of coal is still the biggest problem they have.
Well, even here we hear that the biggest contribution we could make, and our average person could make, would be to buy an electric car and get rid of the gas powered cars. But that then raised the question: well, where do you get the electricity? And I guess there's no single answer to that. Are they? How are they doing in terms of nuclear power? Are they building nuclear power plants?
Yes, I mean, China now is the world leader in nuclear power. Let me just take a look at my little report here and see if I have some. They have the latest numbers that I have. They have 48 nuclear reactors in operation and 12 under construction. And these are, they originally, I think, licensed nuclear designs from Westinghouse in the US, and they have since mastered that technology and have now basically have their own variation of that design. And they are looking at nuclear power as a major export industry. They're willing to build nuclear power plants around the world. So nuclear is one of the industries they've targeted as being a growth opportunity for their industry.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fact. We may not like nuclear power, but that's going to be one of the tools that China uses to reduce their fossil fuel use.
Do they have uranium, or where do they get their uranium?
That I really don't know. I mean, in a country that size and so forth, I wouldn't be surprised if they have indigenous uranium, or maybe they could import the uranium, or if they had to. But I have not heard that there's any shortage of uranium in China. I just don't know.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess there is enough for uranium in the world for the time being, and then of course.
Yeah.
The real threat is that some people want to do reprocessing of uranium and get all the plutonium out and recycle it that way. But that is really a risk in terms of proliferation of nuclear weapons, because people can get access to that much more easily if you have little reprocessing plants here, there, and yon. That certainly makes it much more accessible. But
you can. If you reprocess the spent reactor fuel, you would recover a lot of usable uranium because you don't burn all the uranium in the reactor, and you would recover plutonium, which is a bomb-grade material. But that can all be recycled in new fuel rods. It depends on what you want to do with it. You could.
It's not a question. It's not a question of what we want to do with it. It's a question of what some criminal or some rogue state wants to do with it, and if they can get hold of it more easily, because there are reprocessing things going on all over the place, including in these new small modular reactors. Then, of course, it's much more difficult to assure that we can keep people from building nuclear weapons. That's again a different conversation, but it's relevant because if people keep on building nuclear power plants, there's just more waste available.
There'll be more material available
to do it.
For a long time, the U.S. was the largest source of greenhouse gases in the world because we had the biggest economy. And I forget exactly when, I have it somewhere in my notes, China is now the largest and the US is now the second largest source of greenhouse gases. I think, as we talked about earlier, China, their President Xi has announced to the UN that their goal is to have their greenhouse gas emissions peak by 2030 and to be at net zero by 2060. I think that's an extremely ambitious goal.
By the way, has Biden said what his goal would be? How can we compare them?
Well, I think that we can talk a little bit about the U.S. Because I think there's some good news and bad news. I mean, the good news is we're now going to be doing something about global warming now that President Trump is out. My concern is we might do the wrong thing. I mean, Biden has mentioned a couple of things in his plans. One is, I believe it's to have all electricity produced by renewables by 2035 and to reach net zero by 2050. Craig Smith and I, my co-author, has, we don't believe that's possible, but we can certainly be moving in the right direction and getting there eventually. Biden has also thrown out that he will spend $2 trillion in the first year of his presidency on fighting global warming. And they have very detailed plans on how to spend the money. In my mind, I'm very concerned about that because that's a tremendous amount of money and it could easily be misspent. And the other thing I keep pointing out is there is no money. In the last good year, 2019, we had a federal deficit of about $1 trillion. In 2020, it's going to be like $3.5 trillion. And when they say we're going to spend $2 trillion on global warming, it's all going to be deficit financed. And that to me is very troubling. I also feel that a lot of very good things are happening in the US and around the world, which, as far as global warming is concerned, but they're just not happening fast enough. And so we need to encourage the private sector to move faster. And I'm just a little worried about massive government programs throwing borrowed money at the problem.
Okay, now here, let's compare China and Russia because China and the US, because the aspirations or the goals that you announced they're not corresponding. You say China wants to be peak greenhouse gas emissions in 2030. That means it's going to be the most emissions of greenhouse gas in 2030.
It'll be going down after that.
Yeah, but that's not at all the same as what you said that the US wants to do by 2035 to be entirely on sustainable sources.
No. I think what the US, I think three numbers that get thrown out is that, like California, where I live, the governor has said we will not allow internal combustion engine cars to be sold after 2035. That's one thing, to promote the use of electric vehicles. The state has also said they want all of our electricity to be generated from renewables by 2035. That's another goal. And then the other big goal is to be net zero by 2050.
Okay, but let's take this goal of peak greenhouse gas emissions, 2030 in China. When would the U.S. peak greenhouse gas emissions be? Is there a goal stated for when that's going to be and will be going down?
Well, I mean, the U.S. hasn't set a goal for that number. I think, Craig and I have a number in our book. We did a forecast, and I would say that if we are going to do what we think we can do, we'd probably peak sometime in the next 10 years and start a downward trend. Yeah. We think that's doable.
Okay. And COVID, it kind of helps
Well, I mean, that's a temporary thing because it's
Sure.
not solving the problem. It's just.
Yeah, in fact, there may be a bounce
Yeah.
after COVID where the economy recovers and they start, it probably is going to go up a little bit. So really these goals that they're setting, they're not comparable. It's like apples
No, I
and
mean,
oranges.
they're not directly comparable.
No.
And the other thing about 2050, net zero by 2050, that's what the IPCC has said we have to achieve if we want to keep global warming under 2 degrees C. So that's the importance of 2050. But I don't think we're not going to get there in my mind. There's no way that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions on a global basis fast enough. We think we can bend the curve and be headed downward, certainly well before 2050, and get to net zero sometime after that.
Okay.
But that's the importance of 2050. But China said 2060, not 2050. They're being, maybe that's being a little more realistic.
Okay. Well, it's an ambition, and
Yeah.
I would like to rush it along. I expect
Me
you
too.
to. We agree that things aren't happening fast enough, and
But a lot of good things are happening. Let's not forget that. A lot of good things are happening.
Yeah. Including today, when I think this is the day when Trump gets his second impeachment. I think maybe I'll have a little party at my computer with my friends and celebrate. Okay, it's good to talk to you, Bill, and we'll be back in touch again soon. Okay.
I hope this was what you wanted to hear.
Exactly. Yeah, very good. And I always like arguing with you. I think it's healthy.
Well, they're not arguments; they're discussions.
They are. Sure enough. Okay. Take care. Bye bye.
Don't. I share your interest in human rights. I just think that we need to be realistic about what we can accomplish.
Okay. Well, certainly, global warming has to take priority over a lot of other things.
Well,
Take care.
that's probably the biggest human rights issue in the world today, because it's the poor people that are going to suffer first and the most. Yeah, so.
Bless you. Bye bye.